All right, folks, we're back, and we're going to talk about what materials people like to build their hoop houses out of. So, how do you feel about this topic?
Oh, this is this an interesting one. So I do take a lot of phone calls. People have a lot of ideas how they're going to do stuff. It's very important what material you use, and we'll go down the list here in a second. Talk about what some of those different materials are that people use. I'll start this by saying use the best material you can to do it the best way you can the first time. In this, it'll last you a long time. If you go inexpensive or you try to do it on the least expensive budget you can, what is your labor and your time worth if you have to do it a second? So, getting into that, one thing people call about a lot on the tech line is what size piece of plastic do I need for this size hoop house? Most times that can be calculated. Many times they'll tell me, well, I'm using PVC. So the first thing I try to talk to them about is the material. So PVC itself, the plastic pipe that's used for plumbing, is not really compatible with greenhouse plastic. If you have greenhouse plastic and that material's touching the pipe, over time it is going to degrade it. Just like cheap hardware store clear plastic degrades in the sun, the PVC will do the same thing to it. The next step up from PVC would be, let's say, EMT conduit, which comes in 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch. It is a better product than PVC. It is smaller in diameter, so it has less rigidity to it, as well as the metal itself has a higher lead content, and that's to make it malleable. So when you're building an industrial building, you need to do a 90 this way and 45 over against the wall, and then go up from there and 90 over and tie into a box. You need a material that's easily bendable on the job site. If you needed a large machine to do it, where you had to climb up and down on a lift or some sort, then it complicates things. So by having EMT being a flexible, soft, malleable material, it helps in what it's used for in a day-to-day basis, but it also makes it a little bit weaker to be used as a hoop for a greenhouse, especially if it extends over 10 feet. It becomes very flexible in longer lengths.
And so, folks, we don't want to get snarky here. I mean, it's BootStrap Farmer, right? You got to start where you got to start. I just don't want people going into building a PVC hoop house thinking they're going to continue to use this for 5 years. And I'm sure we can point to several examples out there in which that has happened. However, I don't want you basing your business and the livelihood of your family based off of a structure that historically can have problems during temperature swings, during wind events, during storm events. It's just not something that I think I would want to put my reputation on, especially on in the season after you have so much time and effort invested into a crop, only for it to be taken away, by using a material that wasn't intended for it. And so we certainly don't want you going over budget or anything like that, but certainly do the very best you can on getting the very best you can first and up front, so you don't have to do it again. I mean, hopefully you'll outgrow it, and if you're outgrowing it, that one hoop house will help pay for the next one and vice versa with that exponential scaling of things. But we say this as a cautionary tale because this is the type of phone calls that we get. Again, we're not trying to be snarky or anything like that, and we want you to start where you need to start, but I would much rather see you do a smaller hoop house and then get a second one later on, or add on to that one by moving out the end wall, than starting with a structure that every time the wind blows is going to keep you up.
The next material to build with would be fence top rail. That's what our DIY kit is designed to use. So 1 3/8 top rail for a chain link or hurricane fence that you could get at the local hardware store or big box supply. And those are 10-foot 6-inch sections. They're swaged on one end, so one end of the pipe fits into the other. and you can create a hoop with it by bending multiple sections. It it is a mild steel and it's flexible and it's rigid, being that it's a larger diameter tube than conduit. It's going to have substantial uh, holding capacity versus a half-inch or three-quarter-inch piece of EMT.
And again, that EMT, I want to super stress what you said a minute ago about the composition. Having more lead, being softer, it's a hell of a difference than 100% steel.
Correct.
Okay. So the top rail, also be aware that we have seen a little bit of be aware that we have seen a little bit of flexibility when it comes to purchasing these at the big box stores. Sometimes we see 18 gauge, sometimes we see 17 gauge. I've never seen 16 gauge at a box store. They don't make top rail out of that. Now, 16 gauge is what we use our next item on the list, which is rolled tubes. So these rolled 100% steel tubes that are galvanized, and then in our case, go through an additional clear coating process.
The flow coat.
Yeah, the flow coat. These things are meant to be structural, and so the wider the building, the thicker the gauge, the wider the diameter, and basically we run these things, our particular structures, through structural engineers, so we can see what these things can take. We're not going to release anything that we haven't verified through a third party. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about comparing apples to apples. If you have 2 or 3 companies that you're looking at, and you've decided, well, one's more expensive, but it has this, and one's a little cheaper, but it doesn't have this. Also take into consideration what gauge and what thickness of steel are they using. I think that anybody that you get a hoop house from, it's going to be pretty great. These companies have been around for a while. Everybody's doing I can't point to one other company in the industry that's doing a terrible job. I just know that our design, which was designed for a little bit more air mass and simple construction, easy to put up, and something that's all metal when it comes to our metal kits. That happens to be my personal preference, obviously, but I think when you're comparing kits from other companies, at least be aware that these gauges can play a role in helping them be a little bit more competitive, or maybe the reason 1 or 2 of us are a little bit more expensive.
Now, you mentioned all metal. So I think when we talked earlier segment about comparing apples to apples, well, there are those cases where you buy a hoop house similar to our DIY kit, and it doesn't come with baseboards and hip boards, or in certain, depending on where you're at, sometimes it's a baseboard and a ribbon board. But if it doesn't come with it, so you're going to need wood to supply that. Well, again, in the beginning of this segment, I talked about using the best material you could to build it one time. Do it right the first time so you don't have to do it again. When it comes to our all metal greenhouse, our hip board and our baseboards are metal versus wood. So wood, again, is a maintenance item. Pressure treated or not, if it's in contact with the ground or a moist environment, it will rot, deteriorate. It will fail over time, which means you got to take your lock channel off. You have to take the plastic off. You have to disassemble your hoop house to maintain it, which, again, if you have the ability to do something one time and you never have to touch it again, that would be the route that I go. So again, just remember, if wood's involved in the building of your hoop house, our DIY kits have wood, for example, it's a maintenance item. It's something that you will need to maintain over time, whether it's replacing something if it rots out, or again, you may have to replace all of it at a certain point.
There's also the type of wood that you can pick. I mean, I certainly wouldn't use like a white pine for anything that's going to be in ground contact. Some people simply refuse to use pressure treated because of the fear of leaching some of these chemicals into the ground.
Yeah, in those cases, you could use something that's within the building code that would be a naturally durable wood. So
cedar, redwood,
yeah,
cypress to some degree.
Cypress is another one as well.
All that's going to be available. Like we can get redwood in Dallas, but it's super expensive.
It is expensive.
But cedar is plentiful. If you're up in the Pacific Northwest, hey man, it's redwood time. So
and cypress comes from there as well.
All right.
Right. And again, that material is a renewable resource. So it's like your grass. That stuff grows in the Northeast like grass. I mean, it's they're consistently, as they cut it down, they're replanting it. So it is a renewable resource.
The other thing that they have in the Pacific Northwest that we don't have here is Douglas fir. I would much rather have a Douglas fir one by than the white pine. So even within pine, I wouldn't go as far as to put oak in there because it's super heavy, it's super expensive because it's most of the time over here it's finished out, but it may be completely different in another part of the region.
Right. And you may have a wood locally sourced to you that does the same thing. That's insect repellent, very durable when it comes to being out in nature. So there may be something in your area that works better for you.
Another little thing I want to throw out there is a lot of time I will see somebody hard side their in wall and they'll use OSB or a chipboard type of thing. Just keep in mind that particular plywood, and my previous life at Home Depot, I was part of the lumber, I was going to say program, that's not right, part of the lumber department. And I've actually been to these places, I've seen this made, I've talked to the manufacturers. That is not an exterior glue. So, it's going to be fine for a few weeks or a few months, but over time, even the moisture in the air is going to start delaminating that chipboard. So even if you paint it, it's going to be a mess, especially if it has any ground contact. It's going to wick up any moisture. So if you do want a hard side, which I'm a big fan of in some cases, make sure that wood is going to be there in the long run. Spend a few extra dollars here and there. Of course, it's 2021 and talking about lumber. Nobody wants to talk about lumber prices right now. But either way, it's the investment in yourself that's going to last the long run. With any luck, you're going to be super busy next season. You're not going to have time to go back and finish any of this other stuff because your farm should be growing. So do yourself a favor now and just take care of that.
We got in the weeds on that.
I'm fixing to get even deeper. The one last thing I'll bring up, and it wasn't on our list, so this is a bonus, is your hardware. There is all kinds of different sources and grades and material and alloys that hardware is made out of. We use a great American-sourced galvanized. Zinc also works for the most part. The thing I want to kind of caution about is using one type of metal against a different type of metal. And so that's why more often than not, we're using galvanized on galvanized. So if you want to upgrade to stainless steel, that's a personal preference, but just don't go buy the cheapest possible hardware you can get. The good thing about a hoop house is it's flexible in the wind, and it's like a skyscraper that moves ever so slightly, and radio towers that move ever so slightly. They're meant to have a little bit of flex. So if you're using a cheaper piece of hardware, that shear strength of a bolt, snapping in half is a consideration. So make sure that your hardware is adjusted for that as well. If you're sourcing your own hardware, if you get a kit from us, you don't have to worry about it. So that's it for hoop house materials. Up next, we're going to talk about preparing to build your hoop house, either right after you place your order and why it's on the way, or after you get it, and just what to do and some tips there. So we'll see you next time.